Hi everyone, I'm Senuka Seneviratne. I was a former member of the Royal College debating team, as well as a former member of the national pool in the year 2024. So today I'm going to be doing a motion debrief about a motion from the Henley Debating Championship, specifically the Octo Finals motion, which reads as follows. This house believes that it is in the interest of gaming companies, for example Sony and Nintendo, to aggressively crack down, for example by suing individual fans or forcing websites to take them down, on the creation and consumption of ROM hacks. The Infoslide reads, ROM hacking is the process of modifying a video game to alter the game's graphics, dialogue, levels, gameplay, and or other elements. In series like Pokémon, ROM hacks exist as fan-made games that elevate the enjoyability of existing gaming experiences. Creating ROM hacks often violate many IP laws. The motion will also be down in the description if you didn't catch that. So I'll now talk about this motion. So before I go on into arguments for both proposition and opposition, I'll first talk about the terms in the motion and how that affects the debate. So this is actually a very deceptively spec-heavy motion because knowing what sort of consoles ROM hacks pertain to can affect the way that the debate progresses. So I'll explain these things and then talk about how this affects the debate and how I ended up constructing the arguments that I'll be presenting later on. So firstly, in terms of ROM hacks, what a ROM hack is a modification to a game, which typically pertains to ROMs, or in other words, files of games which are released on older consoles. This looks like the Nintendo DS, the Nintendo 64, the Game Boy. So examples of these games could look like Pokémon, Super Mario, that sort of thing. And these modifications can be anything from translations to cheats to, as the motion suggests, complete overhauls of the design of these games. Secondly, these games are almost always offline and single player, which means that arguments about player retention and microtransactions don't really apply to this debate. And the third thing is that there are often sizable online communities surrounding these fan games, which are created by ROM hacking, which usually involves things like challenge runs, speed runs, or just general content creation. And secondly, in terms of what these corporations are, so the motion is kind of vague in the way that they talk about gaming companies because they don't specify about what sort of companies this actually looks like. The example suggests that this is distributors like Nintendo and Sony because they have consoles like the Nintendo Switch, the PlayStation, respectively. But the issue is that these companies very often don't directly own the IP of these games. The other possibility then is that these are the creators of these games who have a more direct claim over the IP of the games that are being ROM hacked. I think that most teams went under this assumption when they were debating the motion, and I think that this is what creates a more interesting debate, and I don't think that the motion really, given that the motion can be interpreted in different ways, I think that this is the one that makes the most sense because these companies have the most direct claim over the IP of the games that are being ROM hacked. So that's what the assumption that I've used when I was making my arguments. That being said, let's talk about what these stakeholders look like, these companies. Firstly, they care about the intellectual property because they want these franchises to be exclusively tied to their brand name, and they want to capitalize on this by, for example, merch sales or by making spin-off games, etc. Secondly, they care about their reputation. This affects how customers will interact with the company in the sense of buying future games or how much support that they have for future projects by these companies, etc. And how willing they are to make content. So for, the most prominent example I think here is Nintendo because they have a history of aggressively suing or taking down distributors of pirated content, or even in some cases derivative works like videos and streams about their games. The thing is that ROM hacks specifically are in kind of a gray area because they are often performed on ROMs of these games that are pirated, but ROM hacking itself isn't technically piracy. It's more of a set of instructions that are applied on a game. So it is kind of independent of the conversation of like piracy of ROMs. This is more about if these modifications should be sued. And so in that case, there is a little bit of a dispute in terms of if these companies do even have the grounds to sue these creators of ROM hacks. But for the sake of this debate, proposition can fiat that they do because otherwise the debate would not work. That being said, then we can go into arguments for both proposition and opposition. So firstly, on proposition, the first argument I have is in terms of protection of intellectual property. So having an IP be uniquely tied to a company and for them to have the exclusive ownership of it and not have any other games that are based on this IP has a few benefits for this company. Firstly, people are more likely to purchase additional content or remastered versions of existing games when they don't already have an alternative way to experience expansions or additional content within these games. What this means is that if these ROM hacks exist, people are less likely to be willing to spend money on official versions that are put out by these companies. This means that they get less sales, and therefore this locks out an avenue for these companies to be able to make more profit. On the contrary, if they were to sue people who make ROM hacks, this is more likely to deter people from making ROM hacks in the first place. And as a result, they have a more direct claim, and therefore the only option that people have to experience additional content from the games that they like is to directly purchase whatever updates or DLCs that are provided by these companies themselves, leading to them getting more sales and as a result getting more profit. So it would be in the interest of these companies. The second point is in terms of setting a legal precedent, because suing a distributor or a creator of ROM hacks would allow for companies to create a legal precedent for suing individuals who make content that infringe on their IP in the future. What this looks like is, for example, having that legal precedent of this company already having sued people who have copied their IP makes it easier for them to sue them in the future, because they can bring up the precedent in court, and as a result, it becomes more efficient and becomes easier for these companies to defend their IP. This also reduces the defense that individuals would have had in court, because they can't point out, for example, that these gaming companies had turned a blind eye in the past. And suing also creates this chilling effect by deterring people from making ROM hacks or just in general infringing on the IP of this company in the future, which means that the argument that I said before in terms of how it is valuable for a company to have a unique hold over its IP kind of materialize. So that's sort of the idea that I had in terms of setting a legal precedent. The second argument then is in terms of game sales, because these ROM hacks often get fairly popular, and clips and videos about these ROM hacks are often viewed by large audiences on platforms like YouTube and Twitch. So if a ROM hack of a game that is produced by a company happens to contain inappropriate or otherwise undesirable content, and it is seen by many people, this can sort of affect the image that people have of games that are produced by these companies. It can deter them from buying future releases from these gaming companies. This could look like, for example, parents thinking that these games that are produced by these companies are bad for their children, or just people generally making the assumption that these games aren't worth their time. And so as a result of this, you can lose out on an audience who otherwise would have bought these future games. So because of this, these gaming companies have an incentive to try and take down websites that distribute ROM hacks or creators of these ROM hacks, so that they can maintain the pure image of their games, and makes it less likely that people will be deterred away from buying these games by the sort of negative perception that's created by ROM hacks. And secondly, while ROM hacks aren't piracy in and of themselves, they do incentivize piracy, because you still do need the ROM of this game, of whatever game that you want to ROM hack in the first place. And the most common way for people to do this is to do it for free, using shady websites on the internet. And so cracking down on ROM hacking would likely, as a result of making ROM hacks less accessible to the average person, make it less likely that they would pirate ROMs in the first place. This is good, because this also opens up alternative avenues for these companies to sell like maybe remastered versions of these older games, or just in general bring them up for resale. Which would then again allow the company to have another avenue in terms of how they can benefit from their IP, in terms of how they can benefit from the past games that they've made. So overall, those are the arguments that I had for proposition. Moving on then to arguments for opposition, I have two main arguments, firstly in terms of reputation and secondly in terms of infeasibility. So under this first argument of reputation, I think opposition can first establish that sales of these old games don't really matter because they either aren't on the market anymore, so the company doesn't get that much profit from it, or moving on then to my arguments for opposition. I have two arguments, firstly in terms of reputation and secondly in terms of infeasibility. So I think under this first argument about reputation, opposition can first establish that sales of these old games don't really matter. Firstly, because they're likely to not be on the market in the first place because it's been like 20, 30 years since they were released, and so people aren't really buying those games anymore. Or secondly, it could be that these sales only constitute a very small proportion of the company's overall sales. People are more likely to buy more recent games. Having established this then, I think that opposition can talk about why the reputation of these companies is more likely to be better on their side, and why proposition's actions are likely going to end up in the reputation of these gaming companies being harmed. So I have two main ways I think that you can prove this. Firstly is just to say that you are going to ruin your image when you attack gamers and gaming communities, since they are most likely going to be the most loyal fans of these franchises. So by attacking them, by taking down these ROM hacking sites, you are most likely going to directly alienate them because of the fact that most of people who opt into things like ROM hacks in the first place were probably people who enjoyed the original games that were released by these companies and then wanted more content surrounding them. So as a result of this, you end up making the people who cared about your games the most feel betrayed and make them less likely to buy into your future games and less likely to support the company in general. Outrage is also likely to happen. So this means that people who are within these communities might collectivize online. They might make movements, boycotting products that are released by these companies, make videos, and content creators also endorsing this, which would result in it creating a worse reputation for the company in the eyes of the casual viewer as well. And it also makes it more difficult for newer players to join these communities and buy these games in the first place, because there's likely to be a lot of toxicity that festers as a result of the sort of disdain towards these companies when they attack the communities that probably already had a fair amount of support, had a fair amount of people within them. What this results in then is there being less overall support for these companies, less people being willing to buy the games overall, and as a result there being less profit for these companies in the first place, which is obviously bad. The second thing is then just to say that going viral, these ROM hacks going viral is actually good, because this means that people are more likely to opt into games that they otherwise wouldn't have, because these are obviously older games, right? They likely would have not had that much interest in these old IPs, but ROM hacks can then result in there being renewed interest towards these. It creates a new audience, and if this generates enough interest, it then becomes a feasible opportunity for these companies to also release things like sequels or remastered versions that otherwise, without the existence of ROM hacks, might not have had as much popularity. You can also just say that this results in there being more people who after trying out these ROM hacks want to then experience additional content, new things that are surrounding the IPs that they enjoyed, which means that they're more likely to buy into future games that are released by these gaming companies. The second argument then is in terms of infeasibility, which is just to say that there will always be more people creating ROM hacks, and so it is impossible to take down all of them, which means that it is probably going to be a more efficient usage of time and resources to either A, try and directly take down sites and distributors of these pirated ROMs, or by developing new games surrounding those IPs to encourage people to buy games directly from the company itself rather than opting into ROM hacks, when there's more content that they can enjoy and they're more likely to buy into games sold by the company directly. The second thing is just to say that legal fees are likely going to add up if you continue trying to sue all of these creators and distributors of ROM hacks, which might be fine for very large companies like Nintendo, but smaller gaming companies are likely going to be affected by these legal fees continuing to rack up just due to the sheer number of ROM hacks that exist on the internet. And then you can just opposition can just point out that it isn't really feasible for companies to go about this way. And even if there are some detriments from these ROM hacks existing, it's worth it to just leave them there and instead focus your efforts on developing new games. And overall, that's going to be more beneficial for these gaming companies. So that's about all the arguments I had for both proposition and opposition. And yeah, I hope this was helpful.